Today we're going to talk about conservatives versus liberal. It's important to note the difference between conservatives and liberals, especially as we head into what we're going to call the conservative era, or some call the Reagan years. There's going to be a rise in conservatism, and we need to understand what those terms mean to understand the time period. This is going to feel a little bit like a government lesson. So if you've had government, you probably won't have to spend as much time here, but if you haven't or don't really understand the difference between liberals and conservatives, you're probably going to want to spend some time here. So in America, we like to think of politics as being left or right. On the right, you're going to have conservatives, and on the left, you're going to have liberals. And we like to map out what people believe on a spectrum. It's not perfect. A lot of times people will even disagree about what's on the left and what's on the right. But for our purposes, we're going to put conservatives on the right and liberals on the left. And we're going to divide our issues into two groups. You're going to have social issues and economic issues. Social issues are going to be things like how people behave or what you think is morally right. Some people have very liberal views on what is morally right, and others have more conservative views. Conservative being a traditional view, or going throwback to think of the 1920s and women in the house and raising children versus the flappers out drinking and dancing. Traditional view would be, of course, that women should be at home. So these can range from anything from birth control to guns to capital punishment to religion. And you can map that on your spectrum. If you are more conservative, perhaps you believe that you're against birth control, then you would be on the right side of the spectrum, more conservative. If you believe that women should have birth control, or maybe you're even for abortion, you would be said to be on the left, or more liberal. So those are your social issues. The other issues that you can look at are going to be economics. An economic issue is going to be the size of government or government involvements in business, taxes. So for example, if you think that government should be small, you're said to be conservative or on the right. If you believe that the government should have more involvement, then you're said to be on the left or more liberal. Now you can be both. You could be socially liberal. Let's say I believe that it is a woman's right to choose, and so she should be able to have an abortion. I would be socially liberal. However, I could be economically or fiscally conservative, believing that the government should not get too involved in someone's life. So you can fall on either side of the spectrum. We say that if you are sort of not far to the left or not far to the right, we say that you are moderate and in the middle. Of course, this seems like a government lesson, but it does have a lot to do with history. So we want to look at the political spectrum in a historical context. So for example, when we created a constitutional democracy, we are somewhere in the middle on the spectrum. We don't have a lot of government control, but we're not completely without government control. So we put the Democratic Republicans to the right. If you move all the way to the right, you're going to be with no government or anarchy. If you move all the way to the left, you're going to have total government control or communism. And it's important to note where the size of government falls on this spectrum. So what do you need to know? You need to know that conservatives, or the right, believe that large government threatens individual liberties. They're against large government. They believe in states' rights and personal responsibility, and they believe that charity should be left to the private sector. They're not going to support welfare programs like Medicare or Medicaid. They believe that these sort of things create a welfare state. It makes the recipients dependent upon the government. So for the left, or for liberals, they're going to be the opposite. They're going to believe that federal government it is the federal government's role to protect people, and that they should provide help to people that need it. So they're going to be advocates for civil rights, and they're going to be seen as more progressive. They're going to, of course, believe in welfare programs like Medicare or Medicaid, and they're going to be advocates for those who can't take care of themselves. So let's look at these things historically. Let's look at the Great Depression. So if I was to say the New Deal, would you say that the New Deal was liberal or conservative? So thinking about what we know about liberals and conservatives, we know that the New Deal provided much more government intervention. It had a lot of government programs. So we're going to put that to the left, or as being liberal. Think about voting rights for women. We talked about this earlier. What was the woman's traditional role? Well, that would have been a traditional role would have been that she was closer to the home. So voting rights, again, is going to be more liberal. Think about the 1920s and the Scopes trial. The Scopes trial having to do with whether evolution should be taught in schools. Of course, the Scopes trial lost, and it was determined that evolution should not be taught in schools. So that would be on the right, or towards the conservative side. Prohibition. It said that you should not drink alcohol, made drinking alcohol illegal. Of course, that's very conservative. It's restricting a person's rights to drink alcohol. Let's look at the civil rights movement. This basically, in this particular time period, you're going to find basically everything to be on the left, or the progressive side. Brown versus Board of Education. It's moving past the old views of blacks and whites being separate, so that's progressive. The Voting Rights Act, of course, again, moving away from the traditional, and the civil rights as well. What about Vietnam? Johnson's Great Society, of course, that's a continuation of FDR's New Deal, more government programs, so that's going to be on the left. A return to family values, that's going to be on the right. Hawks, of course, are going to be the ones that are for war. Conservatives tend to be for nationalism, a strong government. So your hawks are going to be on the right. Doves are generally going to be people who are less likely to go to war. And so we'll put the doves on the left. And of course, that can be seen in Vietnam when you had the counterculture movement. The counterculture movements generally were against war. And then, of course, during the Vietnam period, you had the sexual revolution with the hippies and free love and the development of birth control. So, of course, that's going to be on the left as well. So it's important that the difference between the left and the right, you may even want to take a test. You can take a lot of these tests online and answer some questions and determine where you fall, whether you are socially liberal or socially conservative, whether you are economically liberal or economically conservative. As we move into then after the Vietnam War, we're going to see a rise in conservatism as a backlash against all the liberal movements of the 1960s, like the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act and the war in Vietnam, and then, of course, Watergate. There's sort of a desire to return to family traditional values. So we're going to see a rise in conservatism, and it's going to be basically a backlash against the presidency of Lyndon Johnson, his Great Society, and the Civil Rights Movement. So the Great Society was Lyndon Johnson's effort to pull people out of poverty. During his presidency, there was a report that went out that said that 19% of Americans lived in poverty. So he's going to make an effort to pull people out of poverty with government programs. He's going to spend money on public education. He's going to spend money on attacking diseases, Medicare and Medicaid, and then, of course, urban renewal. This war on poverty is called his Great Society. And of course, conservatives are not going to like this. They're going to see it as an extension of FDR's New Deal, the sort of making people rely on the government and a welfare state. So conservatives don't particularly like that. Now, conservatives in the South are also not going to like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the Fair Housing Act of 1968 because they see it as an attack against their traditional Southern values. And so Democrats, conservative Democrats are going to start pulling away from the Democratic Party. So the South, which is traditionally solidly Democrat, is going to split off and start joining the Republican Party. And African Americans who are gaining more voting rights with the passing of the Voting Rights Act are going to vote Democratic because Democrats supported civil rights legislation. Now we get Richard Nixon, and he's going to implement something called his Southern strategy to get elected. And the Southern strategy used by Richard Nixon was basically to exploit the conservatives, Democrats in the South who were moving to the Republican Party. So how did the Democratic South become Republican? Well, of course, Democrats would be Kennedy and Johnson, who all supported civil rights legislation. And of course, African Americans are going to start voting democratically. And the Democratic Party is going to see a split. And of course, we've seen parties split before over different issues throughout this course. And this is going to be one of them. The Democratic Party is going to split, and they're called the Dixiecrats. And the Dixiecrats are basically Southern Democrats who want to return to these Southern values. They're going to be against integration, against Brown versus Board of Education, and all of the Civil Rights Act. So those are your Dixiecrats, and the Dixiecrats are going to join. Those are going to be the ones that join the Republican Party. So Nixon employs what is called the Southern strategy, and the Southern strategy is to say that he's not going to enforce the Civil Rights Act, or he's not going to enforce the Voting Rights Act, and he's going to get us out of Vietnam, and that pulls those voters, the conservatives, away from the Democratic Party into the Republican Party, and he wins the election. Of course, we know that Nixon does not fulfill his Southern strategy, that he continues the war in Vietnam, and he enforces the civil rights legislation. He goes even further to form what's called the EPA, or the Environmental Protection Agency. And the Environmental Protection Agency, you need to know the 3 acts that it developed: the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and the Endangered Species Act. Before this time period, there was no legislation on business. So, for example, if you were a business and you were spewing smoke into the air, there was no government agency that said you couldn't do that. With these, we're going to see regulation on business. Of course, conservatives are not going to like this because they're going to say that it hurts jobs. So, in favor of the environment, you're actually taking away jobs. We're also going to see him implement wage and price controls to control inflation, and conservatives are not going to like that as well. So during the 1960s, we're going to see a rise in social conservative and in economic conservatism being what we call fiscally conservative. So in the 1960s, of course, you saw the civil rights movement, and then you saw these other movements emerge. And one of those movements was the women's rights movement, and they were pushing for an equal rights amendment. Liberals, of course, are going to support this, saying that women should be treated equal, that they should receive equal pay for equal work. Conservatives are going to say that the equal rights amendment hurts women because it doesn't protect them, and that women are biologically different, and that we are not equal to men, and that instead of making us equal, that we should be protected. Social conservatives are also going to find issue with a court case that you need to know, and that's Roe v. Wade. Roe v. Wade had to do with abortion and a woman's right to do what she wanted with her body. So if a woman is pregnant and she wants to get rid of her unwanted child, she wasn't allowed to have an abortion. It was illegal, and you had these backroom abortions and women were dying. So Roe v. Wade made it legal to have an abortion up to a certain point. Conservatives are going to say that an abortion is killing a child and that it doesn't matter the woman's right to privacy, that abortion is murder. So you had this divide socially over the abortion issue. We'll look at the Reagan's court later. But that's so you see this rise in social conservatism. Fiscally conservative or economically conservative. Businessmen, of course, are going to oppose these restrictions by the EPA. They're looking at harsh environmental laws that they say are hurting businesses. So then the socially conservative and the economically conservative are going to merge together and form what's called the new right. And they're going to form a very strong voting base. You're going to see during this time period on TV, you're going to have the rise of evangelical churches and televangelists, and they're going to use their presence on the TV to influence politics. And you're also going to see the emergence of radio personalities like Rush Limbaugh, that sort of thing, cable television, the emergence of CNN and Fox News, all of these things to sort of help sort of galvanize the difference and explain the difference between liberals and conservative, and you see the split becoming further and further and more defined. We can put Roe v. Wade on the left and the Equal Rights Amendment on the left and the EPA on the left, and we can put on the right to life and businesses protesting harsh environmental constraints on the right. Now, all of this is going to lead to the election of Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter is going to come to be president. He's going to run on "I'll never tell you a lie" in reaction to, of course, Nixon and the Watergate scandal. But his presidency is going to be proved to be pretty rough. He's going to have huge economic problems. He's going to have double-digit inflation. He's going to face an energy crisis. He's going to face the Iran hostage situation. He had to start off by paying off the massive amounts of debt created by Vietnam. And the economy starts to falter, and he's going to do two things. He's going to start cutting taxes to sort of help stimulate the economy, but he's also going to increase spending. And this is going to cause the economy to just sort of bottom out. It's going to get worse. There is one good thing that it will come out of Jimmy Carter's administration that you need to know about, and that's the Camp David Accords. So America is facing an energy crisis because of difficulties in the Middle East, and we don't want to have a war in the Middle East. So Jimmy Carter works really hard and brings together the Egyptian president, Assar el-Sadat, and the Israeli prime minister, and brings them together, and they actually discuss peace, and he actually prevents from a war from happening in the Middle East. But overall, his presidency is seen as pretty bad. There were long lines at the gas station as people tried to get gas before it went up. Oil prices continued to rise. So you can see Carter's administration really set the tone for we need a big change and a big difference, and that led to the election of Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan is seen as the conservatives' candidate. He's going to be elected by conservatives, and he's going to be loved by conservatives, and his policies really represent, especially the conservative policies, what conservatives really like. And they call it the Reagan Revolution. And let's talk about his economic policies first, and it's called Reaganomics. So if you've never had an economics class, this is going to be a little bit tricky, but if you have, you'll probably figure it out. Reaganomics basically said that you needed to cut taxes to the wealthy because the wealthy were the job creators, and if they didn't have to pay all this money in taxes, then they would have extra money, which meant that they could create businesses which would employ people, and then these people that were employed could then buy and spend. Of course, if you're going to cut taxes, you can't increase spending, which is what Jimmy Carter did. So if you cut taxes on the wealthy, you have to cut government spending as well. Of course, that fits in with the conservative idea of cutting welfare programs and eliminating government. This is called trickle-down economics. So if you cut a cut from the top and they establish businesses, then the wealth will trickle down to everyone else. Or it can be seen as what's called supply-side economics. The businesses are producing, and so then everyone else will spend. They were also all about balanced budgets, and if you can't afford it, don't spend it, or what they call belt tightening. So that's your conservative side, and that's what Reagan, when he's elected, starts implementing as his economic policy. So the opposition, of course, is going to be based on what's called demand-side economics. It's the people's ability to consume goods is what drives the economy. So if more people are buying goods, then that means that then the powers that be would produce goods, right? If you buy more cars, then they have to make more cars, which makes more jobs. It's the opposite side. It's called demand-side economics. The wealthy should pay more in taxes because they can. They have the ability to pay more, so they should. Tax cuts don't go to the wealthy, they go to the middle class because they're the ones buying, right? So, and if they buy more, then businesses will make more. The opposition is also all about deficit spending, which means that that countries will not be always able to keep a balanced budget, and that they can basically that they can borrow money. So you need to be aware of those two opposing ideas, and that Reagan was the embodiment of the conservative idea. So the Reagan Revolution, you need to realize, is a lot about economics and pulling us out of the recession that started under Jimmy Carter. So again, if you were to look at your spectrum, you're going to put demand-side economics on the left and cutting taxes on the middle class, and deficit spending, that's going on the left with the liberals. If you were to put fiscal conservatives on the right, supply-side economics, cutting taxes to the wealthy, cutting government spending, and a balanced budget, that goes on the right. Reagan also is going to go through a lot of deregulation, right? Because conservatives don't like big government. So he's going to try to shrink the government. Government is, in Reagan's mind, the problem, not the solution. So he's going to deregulate the banks. He's going to deregulate energy. He's going to put jobs before the environment. He's also going to take a hard line against the Soviet Union. Now, there were a lot of economic factors that go into the Soviet Union, but you have to remember that we are still in a quasi-Cold War still with the Soviet Union. But under Reagan, he's going to take a very strict hard line against them, and he has a very famous speech where he's standing at the Berlin Wall and demanding that the leader of Russia, President Gorbachev, that he get rid of his communist policies, and this is that famous speech.
We welcome change and openness, for we believe that freedom and security go together. that the advance of human liberty
can only strengthen the cause of world peace.
The advance of human liberty can only strengthen the cause of world peace.
That would be unmistakable.
There is one sign the Soviets can make that would be unmistakable.
The cause of freedom and
that
peace.
would advance dramatically the cause of freedom and peace.
If you seek peace,
General Secretary Gorbachev,
if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe,
if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe,
come here to this gate.
If you seek liberalization,
Mr. Gorbachev,
come here to this gate.
Mr.
Gorbachev, open this gate.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
So, conservatives are going to contribute the subsequent fall of the Soviet Union to Reagan's hard line against communism and against the Soviet Union being so closed off. Of course, liberals and conservatives disagree, and liberals are going to contribute the fall of the Soviet Union to more internal factors. So we want to look at what caused the fall of the Soviet Union. Liberals are going to credit mainly the policies of Mikhail Gorbachev. And Mikhail Gorbachev assumed the leadership of the Soviet Union, and he's going to implement two very important policies. And these policies you do need to be familiar with. The first policy that he implemented is going to be glasnost. And glasnost basically means openness. And he's going to remove a lot of the Stalin repressive, can't talk out against the government, no other political parties. He's going to remove all that, and he's going to give freedom to the press, and he's going to allow citizens to criticize the government. Other parties are going to be allowed to participate in government. So this is a huge step forward for the Soviet Union in the right direction, away from communism. His other policy, perestroika, basically means economic restructuring. And the Russian economy during this time period is very stagnant, and they're facing a recession, and he needs to build the economy back. And he turns to the idea that maybe communism is not the way to go, and that private enterprise should be allowed to help rebuild the economy. So he's going to begin allowing some private enterprise, individuals and businesses can own their own business for the first time. Gorbachev is also going to bow out of the arms race. His policy of non-intervention is going to be the downfall of the Soviet Union, and it's going to cause the Soviet Union to collapse. Because once he starts implementing these policies, those Eastern European countries are going to start breaking away from the Soviet Union and establishing their own independent governments. And they're going to become democratic countries. So whether you think it's Reagan's hard line towards communism in the Soviet Union, or whether you believe it's the internal factors, the fact is that during this time period, the Soviet Union will collapse, and we're going to see a new openness in Russia. So we finally made it from World War II all the way to my lifetime, and we didn't get blown up, right? The Cold War was a scary time period, but we made it through. With Mikhail Gorbachev and Reagan, they came to agreements, and they started reducing armaments, and the fear of nuclear war starts to fade. The Berlin Wall is going to fall in 1989. And we finally come to the end of the Cold War. So that's going to be the end of the lesson. I do want to do a quick fact check to make sure that you are watching these videos. So your extra question is going to be, where were the Winter Olympics held in 2014? And of course that's going to be in Sochi, Russia. So even Russia's going to open up so much that we're comfortable sending Olympians over there to compete. And that is your lesson.